The truth is finally coming out, and it's even more explosive than anyone imagined. What we're witnessing in Cleveland isn't just a simple quarterback change based on performance. This is a full-scale power struggle between ownership and coaching staff that's been brewing behind the scenes for weeks, and an NFL insider just pulled back the curtain on exactly what went down. Jimmy Haslam, the billionaire owner of the Cleveland Browns, who doesn't often involve himself publicly in personnel decisions, apparently put his foot down and demanded to see Shedeur Sanders play. Not next month, not eventually, now. And when the owner of an NFL franchise makes that kind of demand, coaches don't have much choice but to comply, regardless of their personal preferences or previous commitments to other players. Ian Rapoport, one of the most connected and respected insiders in the entire NFL, essentially confirmed what many of us suspected all along. This wasn't Kevin Stefanski's choice. This wasn't the coaching staff organically deciding that Shedeur had earned the opportunity through practice performance or preseason excellence. This was ownership stepping in and forcing the issue because they could see what everyone else with functioning eyeballs could see. Shedeur Sanders is the best quarterback on that roster, and keeping him buried on the depth chart was organizational malpractice that needed to be corrected immediately before the entire season slipped away completely. Now, Rapoport tried to spin it diplomatically, claiming that the plan was always to play Shedeur and evaluate him at some point during the season. That from owner Jimmy Haslam all the way down to Kevin Stefanski, everyone was supposedly invested in Shedeur Sanders and wanted to know what they had at the position. But let's be completely honest about what's happening here. That's narrative cleanup. That's damage control. That's the NFL media machine trying to make this look like a coordinated organizational plan rather than what it actually was, which is ownership overruling their coaching staff because they were tired of watching inferior quarterback play cost them winnable games. If Kevin Stefanski was truly invested in Shedeur Sanders and genuinely wanted to play him, why wasn't Shedeur getting first-team practice reps throughout training camp and the preseason? Why was he the fourth-string quarterback buried so deep on the depth chart that he was basically invisible? Why did it take Dillon Gabriel suffering a concussion for Shedeur to even get an opportunity? If the coaching staff believed in Shedeur's abilities and wanted to evaluate him properly, they had months to do that. They chose not to. They chose to commit to Dillon Gabriel despite overwhelming evidence that Gabriel wasn't good enough. They chose to ignore what was obvious to everyone outside the building, which is that Shedeur Sanders was the most talented quarterback they had. So when Ian Rapoport comes on national television and tries to sell us this story about how everyone in the organization was always planning to play Shedeur and evaluate him thoroughly, forgive those of us who aren't buying what he's selling. What actually happened is much simpler and much more dramatic. Jimmy Haslam watched Dillon Gabriel struggle for weeks. He watched the offense sputter and fail to move the ball downfield consistently. He watched checkdowns, bubble screens, and screen passes thrown over receivers' heads. He watched an offense that had no vertical element, no explosiveness, and no ability to make defenses respect the deep ball. And at some point, Haslam apparently had enough and told his coaching staff that he wanted to see the fifth-round rookie quarterback play, regardless of what the depth chart said. That kind of ownership intervention is extremely rare in the NFL, and it almost always indicates serious dysfunction or frustration with coaching decisions. Owners typically defer to their football people on personnel matters, especially in-season quarterback decisions. They hire general managers and coaches specifically so they don't have to make those calls themselves. But when an owner steps in and essentially demands that a specific player get playing time, that tells you everything about how frustrated they were with what they were watching and how little faith they had in the current direction of the team. The ESPN Cleveland Morning Show conversation was absolutely fascinating because those local media members who cover the Browns every single day were basically confirming what we've all been thinking. Shedeur Sanders was never a legitimate fifth-round talent. His slide in the draft was entirely about off-field concerns, perceptions, and political considerations rather than actual football ability. Mel Kiper, who evaluates prospects based purely on their on-field performance and production, thought Shedeur was the best quarterback in the entire draft class. That evaluation was based on years of experience watching college quarterbacks and projecting their NFL potential. Kiper didn't downgrade Shedeur for his famous father, for supposed attitude issues, or for contract demands. He evaluated the tape and saw a first-round quarterback prospect with legitimate franchise potential. What hurt Shedeur in the draft process was entirely off-field nonsense that had nothing to do with his actual ability to play quarterback at the highest level. There were rumors about interview performances, about wearing headphones during the process, about contract demands and equity clauses. Some of that might have been legitimate. Much of it was probably exaggerated or completely fabricated by teams trying to justify passing on him or by media members looking for storylines. But regardless of the specific reasons, 31 teams made a massive mistake by allowing Shedeur to fall to the 5th round, and Cleveland is about to benefit enormously from that collective organizational failure. The comparison to Cam Ward is particularly interesting and loaded with subtext that casual fans might miss. Ward was the other highly touted quarterback prospect from that draft class who actually went in the 1st round to Miami. There was this prevailing narrative throughout the draft process that Ward was clearly superior to Shedeur, that he was the safer pick, that he had better arm talent or better NFL readiness or whatever other justification teams were using. But now that we're several weeks into the season and can actually evaluate both players at the NFL level, that narrative is starting to crumble. Ward hasn't been particularly impressive. He's had his moments, sure, but he hasn't looked like a transformative franchise quarterback who's clearly superior to what Shedeur is showing in Cleveland. The draft is absolutely not an exact science, and teams make catastrophic evaluation errors all the time. Quarterbacks who are supposed to be can't-miss prospects flame out constantly. Late-round picks occasionally develop into superstars. There's so much luck, circumstance, coaching, and organizational fit involved that predicting success is incredibly difficult even for professionals who do this for a living. But in this specific case, with the information we have right now after watching Shedeur's debut performance, it's becoming increasingly clear that every team that passed on him made a mistake, and Cleveland got an absolute steal in the 5th round that could change their entire franchise trajectory for the next decade. Now let's talk about Dillon Gabriel for a moment, because this situation isn't entirely his fault and he deserves some perspective and fairness. Gabriel never demonstrated that he was better than Shedeur Sanders. Not in training camp, not in the preseason, and certainly not in regular season games. What we saw from Gabriel was an extremely limited quarterback who excelled at checkdowns and short passes, but showed absolutely zero ability to push the ball downfield vertically and attack defenses at all 3 levels. That's not sustainable in today's NFL. Defenses will simply load the box, take away the short stuff, and dare you to beat them deep. If you can't or won't make those throws, you're going to lose, and your offense is going to be predictable and ineffective. Gabriel threw screen passes over receivers' heads. He consistently missed open receivers downfield when they had separation. He failed to extend plays with his legs or creativity when protection broke down. Now, some of that might have been coaching decisions or scheme limitations rather than Gabriel's personal failings. Maybe the coaching staff didn't trust him to throw deep and specifically designed an offense that kept everything short and safe. But whether it was Gabriel's limitations or coaching decisions, the result was the same. An offense that couldn't move the ball consistently, couldn't score points efficiently, and couldn't threaten defenses vertically. That's a recipe for losing football, and Jimmy Haslam apparently recognized that faster than his coaching staff did. The conversation about whether Shedeur should stay in Cleveland or try to force his way out to a different franchise is absolutely fascinating from both a career development and legacy building perspective. There's a legitimate argument that staying in Cleveland and trying to build something there could be the best thing for Shedeur's long-term career and legacy. Cleveland is a franchise with a tortured quarterback history, decades of failure at the position, and absolutely desperate fans who would worship anyone who finally delivers sustained success. If Shedeur stays in Cleveland and develops into a franchise quarterback who leads them to playoff success or potentially even a Super Bowl, his legacy would be enormous. He wouldn't be following in anyone else's footsteps or trying to live up to previous greatness. He would be writing his own story, creating his own legacy, and potentially becoming the greatest quarterback in Cleveland Browns history. Compare that to going somewhere like Pittsburgh, where you're following Ben Roethlisberger and trying to live up to that legacy, or somewhere like Green Bay, where you're constantly compared to the quarterbacks who came before. In Cleveland, Shedeur would be the guy. The first guy. The one who finally ended the drought and brought sustained success to a franchise that's been searching for it for generations. That's an incredibly appealing narrative, and it's the kind of legacy-defining opportunity that doesn't come around often. Sure, Cleveland is dysfunctional. Yes, the organization has made terrible decisions for years. Absolutely, there are concerns about the coaching staff and front office. But if Shedeur can overcome all of that and succeed anyway, his legend would be cemented forever. The flip side of that argument is that Cleveland is a poorly run organization with questionable coaching, limited offensive weapons, and a history of ruining quarterbacks. Maybe the smart move for Shedeur's career would be to get out as soon as possible, go to a team with better infrastructure and coaching, and maximize his potential in a more functional environment. Both perspectives have merit, and which path Shedeur ultimately takes will probably depend on how the next several weeks unfold, and whether the Browns organization shows him they're serious about building around him and supporting his development. Looking at Cleveland's remaining schedule provides some fascinating context for evaluating Shedeur moving forward. The 49ers game is winnable. San Francisco's defense isn't particularly blitz-heavy, which should allow Shedeur to work from relatively clean pockets and make plays downfield. The Dolphins game is extremely interesting because that's Shedeur versus Cam Ward, two quarterbacks from the same draft class with completely different paths who will now be compared directly in head-to-head competition. The tension and narrative around that matchup will be absolutely electric. The Bengals game is a revenge opportunity for the entire Browns team after what happened earlier this season. That's a game where emotions will be running high, and everyone will be motivated to show what they're capable of. The Chargers game against Caleb Williams is another must-watch matchup loaded with history and context. Anyone who followed college football knows about the Colorado versus USC rivalry and the performances Shedeur put up against Williams when they were both in college. That matchup resuming at the NFL level will be absolutely compelling television. Between all of those games, there's a realistic path to Shedeur going 4-2 over the final 6 games, which would give the Browns a legitimate chance at playoff contention and would absolutely cement Shedeur as the unquestioned starter moving forward. If he finishes the season winning 2/3 of his starts, making plays, and showing consistent improvement, there would be zero justification for going with anyone else next season. The Bills and Steelers games will be significantly tougher matchups against playoff-caliber teams with strong defenses. Those will be real tests of whether Shedeur can compete against elite competition or if his success was mostly a product of favorable matchups and circumstances. But honestly, even if he struggles in those 2 games, going 4-2 overall would still be an extremely impressive finish that would validate everything we've seen from him so far. Rookie quarterbacks are expected to have ups and downs, difficult games against good defenses, and learning experiences. What matters is the overall trajectory, the consistency of preparation and performance, and whether he shows he belongs at this level. Everything we've seen so far suggests he absolutely does. The media cleanup and narrative management happening right now from Rappaport and others is predictable, but also revealing. The NFL and its media partners don't want this to look like organizational dysfunction or ownership overruling their coaching staff. They want it to look like a smooth, coordinated organizational decision where everyone was on the same page about evaluating quarterbacks and making the best decisions for the team. But anyone paying attention knows that's not what happened. What actually happened is that ownership saw inferior quarterback play costing them games, demanded that their most talented quarterback get an opportunity, and forced the coaching staff to make a change they were reluctant to make on their own. That's not necessarily a bad thing, by the way. Sometimes ownership needs to step in when coaching staffs are making mistakes or when organizational inertia is preventing necessary changes. Jimmy Haslam might have made plenty of mistakes during his tenure as Browns owner, but apparently recognizing that Shedeur needed to play and forcing that decision was not one of them. That might be the single best decision he's made since buying the franchise, and it could genuinely alter Cleveland's entire future trajectory if Shedeur develops the way everyone hopes he will. Kevin Stefanski is now in an impossible position where he has to publicly support and commit to Shedeur, while probably privately acknowledging that this decision was made above his pay grade. He has to coach Shedeur, develop him, design an offense that maximizes his strengths, and help him succeed, all while knowing that ownership essentially overruled his previous quarterback decisions. That's an uncomfortable dynamic that rarely works out well long term. If Shedeur succeeds, ownership gets credit for forcing the issue. If Shedeur struggles, Stefanski gets blamed for not developing him properly. It's a no-win situation for the coaching staff, but that's what happens when you make questionable decisions at the most important position in sports, and ownership has to step in and correct your mistakes. The Browns being fun again is an interesting talking point that reveals how starved Cleveland fans have been for quarterback play that generates genuine excitement. For years, Browns fans have watched boring, predictable, conservative offensive football that failed to produce points or victories. Now they have a quarterback who can make spectacular throws, extend plays, attack defenses vertically, and bring energy and excitement to the offense. That's genuinely fun to watch, and it's why Browns fans are absolutely demanding that Shedeur remain the starter regardless of what happens with Dylan Gabriel's recovery from concussion protocol. The truth is simple and obvious to everyone, except apparently Kevin Stefanski. Shedeur Sanders is the best quarterback on the Cleveland Browns roster. He's the most talented, the most capable of making difficult throws, and the most likely to develop into a legitimate franchise quarterback. Jimmy Haslam apparently recognized that reality and forced the issue when his coaching staff was unwilling or unable to make the obvious decision on their own. Now we get to watch Shedeur continue developing and proving that he belongs, while the entire football world watches to see if Cleveland finally, mercifully found their answer at quarterback after decades of searching. What do you think about Jimmy Haslam reportedly demanding that Shedeur play? Was ownership intervention necessary in this situation? How significant is it that the owner had to step in and overrule coaching decisions? Do you think Shedeur should stay in Cleveland long-term and try to build a legacy there? Can he realistically go 4-2 over the final 6 games and lead this team to playoff contention? Drop all your thoughts in the comments section because this story has so many layers and implications that we need to discuss and debate. If you made it this far, you're obviously invested in following every development of this story, so make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update when we drop new content. Give this video a thumbs up if you think Jimmy Haslam made the right call demanding to see Shedeur play. Share this with your Browns fan friends because this is the most consequential quarterback decision Cleveland has made in years, and how it plays out will determine the entire future direction of the franchise. Until next time, shake the haters off, keep watching, and keep coming back for more content covering the biggest stories in the NFL.